Right, so my talk today is on, this is something, I guess, a little bit different from what we normally do when we give design systems talks. Normally we like to talk about the actual system that we're building, and normally we like to talk a little bit about the kind of engineering considerations and the design considerations, but most of what I'm going to be talking about today is kind of the more, I guess, the human, the more sort of philosophical reason about why we build these things, and how, sort of by understanding more about that, we can ideally make tools that make our own lives easier and the lives of all the people that actually use our design systems. So can I just actually, before I start, can I get a show of hands? Who here is a designer or would consider themselves primarily a designer? Okay, quite a lot of you guys. And who here is a front-end developer? Full stack developer? You can leave your hands up, that's fine. And who's sort of somewhere in between? Okay, great. I love you guys. That's awesome. Okay. So the start of this talk was inspired by this particular meme. I'm not sure if you guys have seen this. I forget exactly who it was who created this. But I kind of love this because this is a problem, right? And this is a problem when we're thinking about building our design systems. And just as a bit of a recap, I'm going to answer, or at least try and sort of cover some of this a little bit later on in this talk. So this is going to disappear for now, but we'll come back to this a little bit later on. But you know, really we think about our design systems from this regard, right? They give us speed, they give us consistency, they give us maintainability. These are all wonderful, sort of awesome things. And they sort of fit anywhere on this line, right? So they're equally as useful at the point that we're building a prototype, all the way through to getting our code into production, right? They can help us along each of these particular pieces. It's a great way of using those three mechanisms to drive any single part of this outcome. Awesome. So, you know, a design system is there because it kind of really helps us express our ideas. You know, really what I'm trying to get to within this talk is what can we do with that understanding to, as designers and developers from both sides. So hopefully this is going to help, you know, everybody in this room, not just one group of you, to do this. And actually it kind of touches on a talk that we saw about 5 minutes ago who discussed this idea of guidelines for play as a challenge. And that's actually really what the concept of my talk is about. So Diana, thank you so much for bringing that up. So to start this journey, let's go back to the 1700s, naturally. And meet this gentleman called William Playfair. So William Playfair was the founder of graphical methods of statistics, and he lived between 1759 and 1823. Now, this guy was a genius, and what I'm going to show you is something that I think we can sort of think about in the context of how we think about design systems. So William at the time was doing effectively the numbers on what international trade looked like. So he was understanding sort of numerically how international trade took place across various parts of the world, and he was then using that information to drive better trades. And he loved maps, right? So a lot of the time he spent understanding and looking at these maps and working out where he should be sending his ships and all of this sort of stuff, just based on the information and the understanding that he was getting. And one day he had this genius idea. He said, okay, so I've got all these numbers, and I've got this idea of a way of visualizing space. What if I took those numbers and sort of made a map out of them? And what he came up with fundamentally changed the way that we think about numbers today. He created the first data table. And this as a tool is now used by every single person who normally thinks about understanding the relationship in almost any form of data. So he created a completely different interface that allowed people to think fundamentally differently than they were ever able to before. And this was something that just absolutely resonated, right? Really incredible change. So that's just one example of sort of where thinking about these things through a user interface can enable an incredible amount of change in the way that we as individuals think. And hopefully you'll see kind of where I'm going to in terms of building a relationship between how we should be thinking about our design systems. There's another example, a gentleman who really inspires me as well, a gentleman called Professor Alan Dix. And he posits this, which I love, and he says, how many times have you written a paper or report and after having done so, thought, now I understand? And the key thing that he's getting to here is that the thing that you're writing, that relationship that you have with that medium, with that paper, that is not just about taking something that's in your head and putting it down. that's actually a creative process. That understanding of that medium is what gives you that ability to do something that you couldn't before. And so it's super important when we're thinking about creating any sort of form in a medium, is like, how can somebody use that relationship to do something creatively? So, and that's really, when we think about prototyping and design systems, this is a really key thing that we should be thinking about, is how does that change the way that we think? How does that enable us to be super creative with that as an outcome? And it's something that's often missed when we talk about the concept of our design systems. So he says this: writing does not merely record or communicate, but it also transforms our thoughts. So this is really the crux of those last two pieces, right? The tools we use augment thought and enable experimentation, understanding, and reasoning within a medium. Now, the mediums that we just looked at were paper, right? So they're very static. Those mediums are something that you can't really fundamentally change usually. You can create a tool on it, like a graph, but you can't create anything that's interactive. Now, if we look at computing as the concept of what we would say is the natural expression of our medium, the unique element that we have within computing is behavior. We can imbue these devices, these machines, with behavior. You can't do that in any other medium. And that one of the core things that we try and get to when we're building design systems is not just thinking necessarily about how something looks or how something works or how you can compose something, but you're thinking about building these sort of forms of behavior, these components with behavior. So how can we better understand how we think about this stuff? And how can we sort of start applying some of these things to our tools? Well, there's a really lovely model that I like by a gentleman called Jerome Bruner. And this actually came out of a huge amount of research that Jerome was doing into how people learn and think and actually understand working within a medium. And he posits that there's three sort of forms of how we actually think about building understanding. He says that there's an iconic form, a symbolic form, and an active form. And I'm going to describe each one of these because you'll see there's a direct relation to that, then how we design our design systems with these. It's really cool. So the first one is symbolic. Now, let's use the context, for example, to describe this, of thinking about designing a bicycle. One of the things you have to understand when you design a bicycle is the length of the chain. So this is actually how you apparently, I have not checked, but this is apparently how you calculate the length of a bike chain. And you get a really visceral understanding of each of the components if you understand how this particular format works. It gives you a really unique way of thinking about how that chain comes together. This is representative of each of those different cogs, each of those different points within a bike. And it gives you a deep understanding of the relationship between all of those pieces that is only unique really in this symbolic format. So the second form is the iconic. And this gives us a slightly different understanding of how the bike chain operates. We suddenly begin to see the relationship between all of these different elements. We see from a slightly broader perspective how that chain works in context, which we didn't necessarily get from the symbolic, but the symbolic describes the relationships here. And then lastly, and this is actually the most important, is the inactive. But the only way that you can understand what difference you've made between both of those particular formats is to actually go and ride the bike. Like, sure, you can understand intuitively in one what's happened and what sort of effect you're likely to be making. But the only way you can really actually get to the point where you get it and you see that effect is to go and ride it. And this is kind of what we do with our design systems, right? We build these things that we have symbolic representations. We have, the code that we're using to fundamentally structure these things. We have the iconic representation in terms of the documentation, which tells us about the relationships and the formats and how these things come together. And then we have the inactive, which is a way for you to experience using those particular components in that context. And so they're really nice ways for you to start thinking across each of these domains. And for me, actually, one of the things that I've learned that's been super valuable to me is if you're working in one and you're struggling to understand the next step, actually just shift to the other and see if you can think about it in a different way. It's been super useful to me. So really the goal with building all this stuff, right, and thinking across these three domains is that we can get to something that works really quickly, right? We can think about these things in three different ways, and we can apply all these together to something that works and makes a difference. And you can do this from an engineering standpoint. A lot of design systems, they have something like a code sandbox preset where you've got all of your imports already set up, and you can just start dropping in your code, right? And this is great because you're thinking both in your sort of your symbolic, you've got your iconic, which might be your documentation that you might have on a different screen, and you're actually experiencing the behavior of the application directly. So you're able to think across all three formats at the same time. And from a creativity standpoint, this is a really fantastic place to be. So you can see here we go. I've just dropped in some preset component code. I've changed the different actions that can be created there. I then went and dropped in a particular header. And I got to something that worked. I could scroll, the behaviors worked, and it took about 2 minutes. Awesome. And I can begin to understand immediately how that experience is going to be for me as a designer. Super, super cool. Go and test it, see if it works. And that's cool, but what if I don't write React? You go to the design system, you grab one of the components. OK, so let's take the table. Maybe I'll pin this to the edge. OK, let's grab the header. Great, awesome. So we're getting to something that we're thinking is about right. OK, let's see. Is this responsive? Oh, no, it's not really particularly responsive. So it doesn't really reformat itself. OK, fine. Well, I'll just delete one of these components. Move this header up. OK, I want to change the state. This video goes on for a long time. And the key thing that I'm trying to get to here is we've spent all of this time and energy building these incredible behaviors from an engineering standpoint, which are the key thing that we're trying to think about. But to designers, this often becomes completely impenetrable. You end up having to reinvent the wheel every single time you just want to build a prototype. And it takes so long for you to get to this point where you're actually thinking in the active version of your medium. It takes forever. And I get really fed up with this, personally, when I'm working in design tools. And there are ways to solve this stuff, but none of it's easy. So we end up with this. If we want to think across all these three mediums, sure, we have to go and learn React, right? Really, the goal is for us to think quickly, right? We need to get something working as quickly as possible. By the way, I am not picking on that particular design system. This is a trend for every design system. Nobody documents how to do this kind of thinking well in most design systems right now, and I think it's a big hole. You end up with this ability, right, of thinking across the symbolic, the iconic, and the inactive, but only at the component level. Like we always get to the point where, just as designers or engineers, we're only thinking about these components. Like the composition is always left up to engineering, or maybe do it in Code Sandbox, which are very, very, very sort of impenetrable ways to start thinking about building behavior. Really we want to do this, right? We want to actually get to the point where you can use all of the context here, and you can build up to something that really works as quickly as possible, no matter what tools you're using. And this is really important because in the kind of scale of design systems we're building, we're probably building for people who are just focused on wanting to think about how I assemble these codes in Sketch, or wanting to assemble these particular components, without understanding how to write React. Like, sure, you might end up with a unicorn team that's going to be completely cross-functional, but that's not always the case in all companies. And as designers, it often feels like we're kind of getting stuck in that sort of uncanny valley, right? Where we're building the, sorry, if you guys don't know what the uncanny valley is, it's if you have something that's trying to impersonate a human, it's that awkward point where it's not quite human enough, but nobody really trusts it. So, so you end up having to build these sort of UIs again and again. Like for example, form validation. I want to add a new form field to my prototype that's built in Marvel. It takes forever, because I have to go through and then redo every single state. As a React developer, I just drop that in and it's done. But it's not a great experience for designers. So this is kind of some of the challenges that we're sort of facing, I think, in design systems at the moment, right? You've got these amazing static generation tools like Sketch, where you do things like absolute positioning. You've got static viewports, static images. There's no real dynamic data, versus what we have in our actual product, which is constraints-based layouts, dynamic viewports, dynamic behavior-based interactions. And there's a gap here. Like, we've got to do better. So to think effectively, we should aim to get something working as quickly as possible. This is great if you're a developer, as somewhere between a designer and a developer, but our tools are just not in sync at the moment. As a community, we need to work out how to do this stuff a lot better. And we've done simple things, like, wildly we do things like build little tools that allow us to work out how to do animations and stuff better. And these are nice single-use context things that give people who are designers that power to engage with behavior, to think across those three domains. We do things like build little prototypes of how I can take my design system and all of its React components and assemble these things together into something that has, real context. But these are just little chops away at that block. It's not something that's consistent. And if we look at other industries, this is Unreal Engine 4. This is what a a lot of game development companies use. And it's one place that no matter whether you're a designer, whether you're an engineer, whether you're a level designer, whether you're an artist, you come together in this one place to share in the behavior of your application. And you think about adding all of these different layers in the same way. We've got all these different ways of creating this kind of behavior and thinking about the applications. It's an awesome tool. But we don't have anything like this for digital products at the moment. There are little touches towards this. Maybe we could redo the meme like this: software designers, game designers, awesome tools. I don't know. So, okay, so I think you guys are getting the point. We're not there yet, but what can we do today? What can we start to do in our products to start thinking about this better? And there are some really awesome tools out there, but I often see people not using them or not trying to use them or get them involved. Actually, Charlie, you just mentioned trying to get this into your current design system, which is awesome. I would love to know it. This actually should be a video. I'm not sure why this isn't playing. But Framer 10 obviously allows you to import your design system. It lets you actually insert all of your components and have the real behaviors that have been assigned to those components as something that you can then design something with. Super, super cool. I think the layout engine's probably, well, we'll see. I want you guys to go and try and use these products, because people talk about this stuff all the time, and I very rarely see design systems actually saying, hey, this is actually how you go and build a prototype. This is our support for Framer 10. This is our support for how you can go and do behavioral design. There's another one which I really love, actually. This is really awesome. This is Alva. I don't know if you guys have seen this, but this is effectively, again, you declare the imports of all of your different components, and then you can actually literally just drop all of these components in, start editing the content, understanding what that layout looks like. Really, really cool tool. Again, it's quite early, but this stuff is going to become, I think, more and more important over time. Then lastly, one that everyone's super excited about is Interplay. I don't know if you guys have seen this yet either. This hasn't been launched. It's still in beta, but I was very kind enough to get a full demo of this. This allows us to effectively import, again, all of our... This should be a video too. Why are my videos not working? Oh, it is working. OK, cool. This allows you to actually import all of your design system components. You've got different layout mechanisms that are all based on constraints-based systems. We should be investing our time in learning how to integrate these tools as designers. Like, we shouldn't be happy with the status quo that we have in things like Sketch. So these are the things that I want you guys to take away today, because I want this stuff to progress. I really want this stuff to work, and we have to come together and try to do this together to make this work. So designers, find and love tools that let you work with coded behavior. All that work that your team is doing to get this behavior into those components and make it composable. Try and get it in there. It's super important. You can learn just enough code to be dangerous. You can learn Code Sandbox. It's super easy to just drop those React declarations in there. It'll break. It'll be confusing. But try it and stick with it. It's worth doing, because having that ability to think through the behavior is super valuable. Pair prototyping, again, super powerful. If you work in cross-functional teams, just sit together and build the prototype. It's amazing how quickly you can make that difference. And if you're not in cross-functional teams, suggest that there's a good reason for you to go and try that, because it makes it super easy to get to something that really fundamentally works. For developers, again, pair prototyping, super powerful. Go and help a designer. Sit with them, help them build that really cool prototype. Developers, you can enable designers to think as fast as possible with the behavior you've created. Like, all of those tools we just looked at, they require input from you to enable them to work for those design systems. So make sure that you do enable them to do that. And everyone talks about designers learning to code. Screw it. Developers, go and learn design. It's, if you love front-end stuff, you already probably think about this. And so for everybody, I kind of want you to take this away, right? Document building prototypes from your components quickly. It's very, very rare that I see this in design system documentation. How do I get to something that works as a designer as quickly as possible? How can I use those behaviors? How can I not have to go through that process of building every single frame that represents the behavior that's already been made by my team? And how can I experiment with support and give experiment with support and give feedback on behavioral design tools? So many of these tools are disappearing through lack of support. And it's because we're so set in the way that we think about building these products already. We need to go and use this stuff and give these people feedback so that we can get to that next generation of what these tools are going to look like. So looping back, hopefully we'll get to the point where 100, 200 years from now, we'll look back and we'll see, OK, yeah, as a format for thought and as a medium, the design system completely changed the way that we thought about structuring our organizations and our companies. And it gave us an ability that we've never had previously. Just like we saw with writing, just like we saw with how we think about data and charts. So I hope that made sense for you guys today. Thank you very much. I'd love to find out. I'd really love to find out how you are trying to solve this in your companies. There's so many different ways to do this. And there's so much that we can learn. And there's so far that we've got to go yet to build better versions of these tools and better ways for us to think about using them. Like, this is just the beginning, and it's such an exciting place for us to be. Yeah, and if you completely disagree, I'd love to hear about that as well. So thank you.